morning, all. I just wanted to come out and say thank you to Colonel Dillon. Colonel Dillon has a very special place in my heart because he and I started about the same, like within a few weeks of each other. And Colonel Dillon had volunteered for this position, and he's done over 1,100 media engagements in a year. And so it is with a heavy heart that he leaves us, but he's done a fantastic job. And all of our spokespeople are so important, but Colonel Dillon has talked about the liberation of Mosul, of Raqqa, as well as Iraq. And so I just wanted to personally say thank you. He's headed out to be the Chief of Public Affairs at U.S. Army Africa, I'm sorry. And so he'll be heading to Italy, a hardship post, I have no doubt. But he's also has a lovely family, and he'll be able to see them. So I just wanted to say thank you, Colonel. Appreciate everything you've done. You have set the standard, and just best of luck, and do stay in touch with all of us and let us know how we can help you moving forward. So with that, I will hand it over to Eric.
All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm glad to see you all, and Colonel Dillon's last press briefing. He's been a great source of information and help, and a great friend to a lot of us, and he's certainly going to be missed. Today, we'll turn it over to Colonel Dillon. He's got a few videos to share with you as well, added bonus, and then we'll take your questions. Colonel Dillon.
All right, thank you, Eric, very much. First, I'll get started with Iraq, and then we'll move to Syria. This week, the Iraqi Air Force conducted a strike on a known ISIS headquarters in Syria that was being used to smuggle ISIS terrorists. This complex operation was planned and conducted by Iraqi security forces with support provided by coalition. This strike demonstrated Iraq's willingness to do what is necessary to secure its citizens, as well as their role as an important partner in the global coalition to defeat ISIS. In the past 4 days, polling stations across Iraq prepared for the upcoming election. The Iraqi security forces, in conjunction with Iraqi government officials, also conducted rehearsals of security operations and security planning. In the past week, the Iraqi security forces continued to aggressively pursue ISIS remnants throughout the country, destroying 4 tunnel systems and locating 27 weapons caches and more than 30 improvised explosive devices and mortars throughout Iraq. During their operations, the ISF also detained 9 suspected ISIS terrorists. While hard work remains after the defeat of ISIS's tyrannical self-proclaimed caliphate, there are encouraging signs that life is returning to normal. In the past month, various groups across Iraq and Syria, including Assyrians, Yazidis, and Kurds, celebrated Nowruz for the first time in years free from ISIS. And in Mosul, the United Arab Emirates, a valued partner in the coalition, pledged to assist Iraq in reconstructing the Al-Nuri Mosque and the Hadba Minaret, which were destroyed by ISIS as they withdrew further into the city in June of last year. Iraqi security forces continue to provide security that enables stability necessary for rebuilding and reconstruction to take place. Moving on to Syria, in the past week, the coalition conducted 14 strikes against ISIS terrorist fighters and defensive fighting positions in Syria. In the following 2 strike videos, you will see coalition airstrikes on an ISIS headquarters building and an ISIS vehicle-borne IED facility. And Eric, please let me know once those are complete.
Okay, we just saw the first explosion. Now the second video is beginning. And that's the second explosion.
All right, very good. The coalition's ability to effectively target and destroy remaining ISIS terrorists is largely due to a constant overhead presence of various intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms that continuously soak up intelligence on ISIS in southeast Syria and along the Syria-Iraq border. We will continue to conduct operations that limit ISIS freedom of maneuver and also constrain their ability to generate forces and degrade their command and control nodes until the terrorist organization is defeated. In addition to servicing ISIS targets, the Syrian Democratic Forces recently announced the capture of Mohammed Haidar Zamar, a Syrian-born German national who worked as a recruiter for ISIS. The Syrian Democratic Forces continue to prove they are a capable force, defeating ISIS throughout most of north and eastern Syria, but also detaining hundreds of foreign terrorist fighters. Terrorist fighters in the region are attempting to sneak away to establish new safe havens or return back to their home countries to recruit, plot, and execute attacks. These terrorist tradecraft, passports, and relationships represent a global threat to the civilized world. The SDF are denying ISIS the ability to do this. Also denying ISIS the ability to come back to liberated areas, the Raqqa internal security forces continue to grow, improve, and provide Raqqawis with security. The coalition has trained many of the RISF on law of armed conflict, weapons familiarization, first aid, and counter-IED awareness. The Raqqa Internal Security Force is subordinate to the Raqqa Civil Council, a local body that is representative of Raqqawis and responsive to their needs. Just last week, on April 19th, that marked the first anniversary of the formation of the Raqqa Civil Council, and the RCC have been instrumental in instituting stabilization projects in an effort to bring life back to Raqqa after the defeat of ISIS. One such initiative is the restoration of the region's canal system, restoring water to tens and thousands of northeast Syrians. According to the Raqqa Civil Council, water services now flow as far east as the Deir ez-Zor province and supply hundreds of wheat farms throughout the region. As summer approaches, the Raqqa Civil Council aims to construct more than 20 water distribution points throughout the city, ensuring residents have clean access to clean water. Finally, I would like to highlight the contributions made by our partners from New Zealand and Australia in remembrance of Anzac Day tomorrow. Anzac Day is a national day of remembrance that commemorates those who served and died in all wars, conflicts, and peacekeeping operations. Tomorrow, Australians, New Zealanders, and fellow coalition members remember those who have sacrificed for their nations and to those who currently serve. Aussie and Kiwi service members are committed to the mission to defeat ISIS, from planning strikes to training thousands of Iraqi security forces. The coalition is stronger and more effective thanks to our brothers and sisters from Australia and New Zealand. And today I proudly wear their patches on my sleeves. You got the New Zealand patch right there, and there's the, don't look at my guns, and the Australian patch right there with the kangaroo, pretty cool. So I'm just honored to serve with such great teammates. And to our Aussie and Kiwi friends, I say, fair dinkum, you great mates. And with that, I'll happy to take your questions.
Show pretty much ended this brief. Bob Burns, AP.
Thank you, Colonel Dillon. Last week you mentioned a concern about a possible resurgence, or at least some gains possibly being made by ISIS in the Middle Euphrates River Valley while the SDF was distracted. I'm wondering a couple of questions. Is the SDF showing any signs of going back on the offensive after the Afrin? And secondly, are your concerns playing out to any extent that ISIS is making any kind of gains at all in that area?
All right, thank you, sir. So I want to clarify, last week when I talked about any possible resurgence of ISIS, I was referring to the west side of the Euphrates River, and I was talking about areas where we are not supporting the SDF. I was talking primarily areas that have been liberated by the pro-regime forces backed by their Russian counterparts. There has been absolutely zero land that has been reclaimed by ISIS on the east side of the Euphrates River. We have put obstacles into place and have constructed things to contain ISIS in the two areas where we are currently supporting our forces to defeat the remaining locations where they hold territory. And that is in Dashisha along the Iraq-Syria border, and in Abu Kamal, north of Abu Kamal, on the eastern side of the Euphrates River in a town called Hajin. So I just want to make it very clear, there's been absolutely no ceding of territory on the east side of the Euphrates River where we support our partners. So I'll go ahead and see if you have a follow-up to that, sir.
Yeah, the other question I had was whether you're seeing any encouraging signs from your point of view of the SDF being reorganizing, regrouping to go back on the offensive in that area.
Well, what I'll say is, we continue to understand, their predicament and where they are, but we are absolutely committed to the defeat of ISIS. And as we've mentioned in the last 2 weeks, we as a coalition have conducted strikes and upped the number of strikes that we've conducted on the eastern side of the Euphrates River. That said, we are encouraged by the return of some Syrian Democratic Force partners to the Middle Euphrates River Valley. I will not go into details on how many and where there will be a raid, but there are some encouraging signs to see that more combat power is returning to the Middle Euphrates River Valley to really turn it on to the ISIS elements, those two locations that finally remain.
Okay, thank you. And next, Idris Ali, Reuters.
Sure. Dylan, sorry, Colonel Dylan, just following on from Bob's question. So these are fighters that were in Afrin that are coming back to the MIRV?
I'm not going to say exactly where these fighters are coming from. Oh, I've got a little reverb there. So all I'll say is that we are starting to see more fighters starting to return to the Middle Euphrates River Valley, and as we look to continue and eradicate and annihilate ISIS in the final two remaining locations where they hold territory.
A few months or weeks ago called it an operational pause, or a pause of sorts, because SDF fighters had been distracted. So is that essentially over now?
So the way I've clarified, I've characterized it as that the SDF have been limited in their ability to conduct offensive operations, and so that actually did happen around the February timeframe. So what did we do? And I explained this a little bit last week. Is because of that limited ability to conduct offensive operations and continue to put pressure on these ISIS elements, we have been able to use the ISR assets available to the coalition to identify targets, and we're now starting to strike targets. I think over the course of the last 2 weeks, we've seen an increase of about 100% in the number of strikes that we've conducted in Syria. But as we start to see more Syrian Democratic Force fighters coming back, then that pressure on ISIS on the ground could very well also help. It definitely will help in the eradicating these final two locations.
Okay. Next, we'll go to Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. Then after that, Jeff Selden from VOA.
Thank you, Colonel Dillon, for doing this, and best of luck in your new position. I have a question on General Funk's trip to Erbil. He met with Chancellor Barzani there. Could you give us a readout on that meeting?
I don't have a readout on that meeting just yet. I can confirm that General Funk did meet with Chancellor Barzani and other senior leaders. That is not uncommon. General Funk has met with Chancellor Barzani several times. I suspect he will meet with him again in the future. But I do not have a readout of what was discussed, but I'm sure it was all focused on security issues and how the coalition can continue to support the Peshmerga and Kurdish security elements as we look towards the elections and into the future.
Are you encouraging cooperation between the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga in the disputed territories to control the violence there?
I will say that we are encouraging the government of Iraq, Iraqi security forces, Peshmerga, to work together. We have seen how that has been successful. We saw that they worked together in Mosul. We saw they worked together in Tal Afar. We saw they worked together in Hawija. And ISIS, they will look for seams, both metaphorically and literally, on the ground. So the government of Iraq, Prime Minister Abadi, knows that all Iraqis require security, and that includes northern Iraq. So the coalition is working together with both Peshmerga and government of Iraq with training, with equipment, with support, but also in working together so that they can identify ISIS threats, ISIS remnants, and go after them.
Okay, thanks. Jeff Zeldin, Voice of America.
Colonel, thank you very much for doing this. You talked a little bit about the two areas where ISIS fighters are now concentrated in Syria, but can you give us a better sense of how many fighters are there and whether and to what extent ISIS fighters are spread out throughout the areas where there's some fighting, including in the areas that have not been liberated by the coalition? What type of concentration, what type of threat are they posing to coalition forces, other areas, and what type of, do you have any sense of how they're communicating? How, if it's just small bands operating independently, or is there some larger command and control? You talked about a little bit also how they're trying to sneak away and get back to other safe havens. I mean, is that an organized effort or is it ad hoc? What can you tell us about the ISIS presence overall in Syria and the way it's a threat, whether it's a concentrated threat or a more dilute but diverse threat?
Okay. If I don't hit all of those questions, you can come back. But first off, on the communications and where are they concentrated? Those two locations are where they still hold territory, where they are concentrated, where they are attempting to reconsolidate. You saw one of the strike videos that showed that they are still attempting to build vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. So, so these two areas is what they've got, and that's really it. Otherwise, they are out in remote, sparse areas, or they are hiding in onesies and twosies amongst population. As far as their ability to communicate, I just know that we are obviously looking at several different ways on how they communicate and look to rip apart any type of networks that they still have. We've been able to do that through many of the different aspects that they have used to run their so-called caliphate, from whether it's recruiting, whether it's financing their operations, whether it's by plotting and planning external attacks in other areas throughout the world. They have, and the drone networks as just another example. Those have been ripped apart and are almost non-existent at the moment. And that's the intent, is to continue to drive the SDF and to drive our partner forces to a point where they no longer hold territory, and then they no longer have the ability to reconsolidate, regroup, and conduct attacks, and even in small types of attacks. So I'll go ahead and pause there, and if I missed any of your questions, please follow up.
Just to follow up, then, with the onesies and twosies, it doesn't sound like that bad, but is there any sense of how many onesies and twosies are out there across the area that ISIS formerly held, and what type of danger might some of those fighters present? They've had battlefield experience, perhaps they've been recruiters. Are they potential sleeper cells or potentially starting up new points of resistance against the coalition and the SDF?
Okay, good question. So you take, for example, the Syrian-born German national who was a recruiter for ISIS. He was someone that was not in Haji and was not in Dashisha, but the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they have with hundreds of other foreign terrorist fighters that are attempting to flee the area, they've been able to capture them. You've also seen in places along the border where the Iraqi security forces, in the area near Dashisha along the border, as terrorists attempt to flee, those locations, they are being captured as well. So the only two places where they actually control are even a group of more than what we would consider to be, I think, 4 or 5. That's something that Prime Minister Abadi had mentioned in his weekly address last week, is that any of the ISIS elements that the Iraqi security forces have encountered or found in Iraq, they have not exceeded 4 people at any one time. So that goes to show potentially a snapshot of what ISIS looks like when they don't hold territory, and as they attempt to get together and they attempt to conduct attacks, they've been thwarted largely throughout Iraq, as an example.
Much. Next to Wes Morgan with Politico.
You can tell us a little bit more about the types of coalition support that were provided to the Iraqi Air Force strike inside Syria, and what kinds of platforms, what kinds of stuff beforehand.
Okay, so Wes, thanks for the question. Number one is the majority of the support that the coalition provided was intelligence support on the target, and both before, during, and after. We also provided some other assets in the air nearby that were also a part of the support package. But it really was the Iraqis who planned this all the way through. It was their commitment and their coordination also with their neighbors and the Syrian government before they conducted these strikes. They were successful, and not only is Iraq a coalition partner to fight ISIS in Iraq, but they are a coalition member. And as I have gone about this job and have gone to different places like London and Berlin, Iraqi senior officials are very prominent in providing the information that is helpful to all of the coalition, the 71 nation coalition. So that's just a small insight into their role as they continue to improve, as they continue to get better, and their experiences in fighting ISIS, I think, will be worthwhile for the rest of the greater coalition.
Just a quick follow-up. Were any troops able to do sensitive site exploitation on the scene of that strike, whether coalition or Iraqi or whoever?
I will not. Number one, I don't know, but number two, I would say that based on where that target is, or was rather, I think I can use a past tense now, is in a place where there's still a very high ISIS activity. So this is still in one of those two areas where ISIS still holds territory.
Okay, thank you. And next to Jeff Schogel with Task and Purpose, and after that we'll jump to Ryan Brown with CNN. Jeff?
Thank you, Colonel. One of my great failings in life is that I'm bad at math. You had mentioned that strikes in Syria are up 100%, and I think you had mentioned earlier that in the past 2 weeks, coalition air forces had launched 14 strikes in Syria. So is it accurate to say that the strikes in Syria have increased from 7 to 14?
So what I'll do is when I go back, I get a weekly rollout of, and I don't have both of those with me, but I know that every single day I get a up to date last 7 days. And yesterday when I went through that, it was we doubled the amount of strikes since the week previously. So all of that information, all that data is readily available to all of you through our strike releases. But I'll be happy to go back, crunch those numbers, and send it to you. But we have, without a doubt, increased the amount of strikes that we have conducted in Syria as a result of soaking up all of this intelligence and target information.
I'd appreciate that information. Also, I've heard about another insurgent group in Iraq called the White Banner. Can you talk about how big this group is and what kind of a challenge they pose?
We've heard of the same group, and I've heard called White Banner or White Flags, and they've predominantly been located in and around areas of Kirkuk, Tuz Kermatu, and the mountain areas in and around there, which I'm familiar with because that's where I spent most of my time in 2003. But what I will say is that they're suspected to be offshoots of ISIS, and whether they call themselves a different name, it's still ISIS elements, and they are still targets for the coalition and for the Iraqi security forces. And I know that the Iraqi security forces recognize this group and have aggressively pursued them in their operations, particularly in that area that I just mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Ryan Brown, CNN.
Hello, Colonel. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for the year of putting up with us in these briefings. Just a couple follow-ups on Zamar. You mentioned that he was working as an ISIS recruiter when he was picked up by the SDF, and you said he wasn't picked up in Hajin or Dashisha. Can you say where he was captured, and has Coalition had access to him yet?
Okay, Ryan. The SDF captured Zamar about a month ago, and I will leave it to the Syrian Democratic Forces who have captured them on a unilateral, their own independent operation that resulted in this capture. They can currently detain him, and as far as any type of further intelligence gathering from the coalition or the United States, I'm not going to address that right now. The SDF, they have him. He is detained, and I'm certain that we will move forward with trying to exploit some information and to be able to use that to illuminate potential other senior ISIS leaders that he was associated with.
Can you say how many U.S. citizens have been captured by U.S.-backed forces in Iraq or Syria fighting with ISIS, what that number is? And then on a totally separate note, there was a report in Syrian state media, and I think the AP, that the regime had reached a deal with ISIS pockets in the Damascus suburbs to evacuate them into other ISIS-held areas. Are you guys tracking that, and is it a concern?
Okay, so first off, I'll have to come back to you. I do not know the number of U.S. citizens that have been captured by the U.S. and or SDF, whether it be together or unilaterally, but we'll come back to you on that. And as far as the reports on ISIS and the regime potentially coming up with deals, I've seen the same thing in open press. What I can do is, again, point to some of the statements that I made last week in reference to the regime's either unwillingness or inability to address ISIS in areas that have once been liberated and then retaken. Southern Damascus was one of those. We've seen this elsewhere throughout the areas where the regime have initially defeated ISIS liberated areas. So this is a trend that unfortunately has continued to play out over the course of the last 2 years. Is it a concern? Yes, it is a concern because we know collectively the evil that ISIS is. But right now, the coalition is very focused on defeating ISIS in the 2 locations that I've mentioned before, and then preventing the resurgence in areas where we have assisted our SDF partners in liberating. So that's where our focus remains, but ISIS anywhere is a threat, as we have seen in the past.
Okay, next we'll go to Lucas Tomlinson with Fox. After that, we'll go to Jack Detch with Al Monitor. He's way in the back. He may need a microphone. Lucas, go ahead.
Colonel, back over your tour, what would you say made the biggest difference in the ISIS fight?
Well, I think I would say, so number one, you got obviously two different theaters. You have Iraq and you have Syria, but I would say that there is a tipping point somewhere in each of the countries where you broke ISIS, and the confidence level in our partner forces, whether that was the Iraqis or whether that was the Syrian Democratic Forces, just started a snowball effect, and it was either a confidence boost or a blow to ISIS that allowed success to continue to feed off of itself. And in Mosul, I think that was clearly the case, and because you saw immediately after Mosul the willingness of ISIS to fight and stay and die in place like they did in Mosul just was not there. And I think it also has to do with a lot of the confidence and the experience and the commitment from the Iraqi security forces and their ability to really operate in complex operations. You heard me talk last week about where they were 2 years ago and hit with a lone M1A1, and then they've increased to doing very, very complex operations and doing it very well. And they continue to get better every single day. And then on the other side in Syria, you saw in Raqqa, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they did not stop. As soon as Raqqa was liberated, they immediately, as a matter of fact, Raqqa was still continuing, and they had ended up piercing all the way down to Abu Kamal in the middle of the Euphrates River Valley to defeat ISIS where they still held territory. So I'm very confident, and we're not going to give timelines on this, but I'm very confident that ISIS will be completely defeated, militarily defeated, and especially in this final about 2% of where they hold territory on the eastern side of the Euphrates River. The SDF are that good. They've proven themselves again and again and again that they're capable of standing up to ISIS and defeating them. And then above and beyond that, what they are doing for the world as far as identifying, capturing, detaining foreign terrorist fighters that are from dozens of countries throughout the world, I think is a mark to how good they really are.
And finally, with this Iraqi strike in Syria, the Iraqi military said they had consulted with Syria's president, or at least Syria's military. Was the U.S. part of that consultation that you know of?
No, not that I know of, but it's not uncommon for Iraq to coordinate with Turkey, Iran, Syria, who are their partners or rather neighbors. So I don't find that to be strange at all.
Okay, thank you very much. Next to Jack Detch, Al Monitor.
Colonel, thanks for doing this. Just seeing some reports on social media that the U.S. is building a new outpost in Hasaka in northern Syria. Are you upping construction in that area at all?
We will not discuss locations and or personnel and where they're located. We certainly will say that we will make necessary improvements to locations to support our operations and to support our partners in the fight to defeat ISIS in these last 2 spots.
Yeah, and then just with the French president in town, can you talk a little bit about what French troops are doing to support coalition operations and if more of them will be arriving soon?
I certainly won't talk on behalf of the French government or the French military. They are a vital and unbelievable contributor to the coalition. I mentioned last week that that they have their anniversary, 3 years to the coalition. That includes strike aircraft, that includes ground artillery forces, that includes trainers. So they are very much represented throughout the coalition. But as far as what they are going to be doing in the future, I will leave that to the French government to address.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on name and outlet.
Yeah, thank you. I think we lost him.
Brethren.
Ryan,
I won't bring him up.
Out, and we haven't heard most of your last answer. If you could repeat, I apologize.
That's okay. I waited to the last minute. I was smiling because we have my French counterpart here, and as much as I'd love to bring him up here and have him provide the answer to you, I won't do that.
Okay.
Thank you, Fadi Mansour with Al Jazeera. Colin, I'm sure you're aware of the reports about potential deployment of Arab forces in Syria as an idea. Has there been any discussions about that option inside the coalition? And another question is, I'm just wondering, why did the Iraqis conduct that airstrike in Syria? Why wasn't you guys? Was there like any operational, I don't know, issues related to that operation, or was it just to showcase how good the Iraqis are?
Okay, so the first question, clearly we've seen in the news and some of the statements about potential Arab contributions from Arab countries. First off, I would say that there are several Arab countries that already provide support to the coalition, both militarily and then through other means, whether they're monetary contributions to stabilization efforts or also sit on some of the boards and the working groups that are focused on either counter-finance, foreign terrorist fighters, or stabilization. But as far as I won't get ahead of any kind of diplomatic discussions about what could be, so I will not speculate on that. As far as why the Iraqis conducted these strikes, Prime Minister Abadi has said multiple times over the course of the last month that he will protect Iraqi citizens that threaten Iraqi citizens. And you have one of the locations where ISIS still holds territory, and it abuts right next to the border between Syria and Iraq. And he said that he will conduct strikes outside of Iraq and in the region in areas that where ISIS can threaten Iraqi citizens. And so I think you have, number one, you have a necessity and a need to conduct strikes, and then number two, to show that they are capable of this. And it's not just in Syria. That made news because of it being in Syria, but the Iraqi Air Force conducts strikes daily throughout Iraq in support of their forces and in support of their operations.
Okay, thank you very much. Next goes to Louis Martinez, ABC. He's way in the back, I hope. Speak up, Louis.
Thank you, Eric. Colonel Dillon, thank you again for all of your help this past year. I really appreciate it. A question about the rebuilding and the threat, the terror threat in both Iraq and Syria. How is the rebuilding effort going inside Syria? I mean, obviously the government doesn't seem to be creating the initiative there for the rebuilding effort in Raqqa and other places. How is that going? And how is it going inside Mosul, where I think the Iraqis are the ones who are footing the bill? And there seems to be a terror threat developing inside Iraq. How do you describe the ISIS threat right now inside Syria? Is there also a terror threat in those liberated cities, or is it still more of a battlefield effort?
Okay. As far as the rebuilding efforts, I just want to make it very clear that the coalition and the military efforts are for securing areas that enable the stabilization to happen. And there are several contributors from the global coalition that have provided monetary contributions to these efforts, but a lot of it is being done in a whole of government approach. So particularly for the United States, you have a Department of State organization called Start Forward that is located in northern Syria that is assisting through the U.S. Through the United States to provide this support. But that also exists through other countries, and also exists through non-governmental organizations, and really largely through these local councils like the Raqqa Civil Council, identifying what projects are needed, what projects are required and are necessary, so that they can prioritize that according to the needs, what the local Raqawis need. So that is a short answer for Syria. In Iraq, you have the United Nations Development Program, and they are using a lot of their efforts and receiving contributions and flow through the government of Iraq to do the same thing. So I guess I should not be the one providing too detailed of an answer on this, but our efforts are really focused on security that allows the stabilization and the rebuilding to happen. As far as the ISIS threat and where it exists, we know that ISIS, even after they lost territory, that they weren't going to just completely fold up and run away. We know that they want to come back, they want to regroup, they want to become relevant again. And it's the Iraqi security forces identifying these threats and doing something about them before they become an attack or a large attack. And we point to, last week I mentioned it, but you just had most recently the Kadamiyya pilgrimage that saw 9 million people come through Baghdad. During that pilgrimage, there were 2 attempts of suicide bombers to do something spectacular, and the Iraqi security forces were able to identify them, stop them, and stop that threat. So there's an example of the Iraqi security forces putting in layered security and identifying these threats before they can become a real problem.
Okay, thank you very much. I know Lori Milroy has a follow-up. Has anybody else who hasn't had a chance to ask a question have anything? Okay, Lori.
Hello, sir. A question. ISIS has said that they are going to attack the Iraqi elections. You shouldn't vote. You're an infidel if you vote. Are you seeing stepped up ISIS preparations for attacks on the Iraqi elections now?
What I will say that there's been an increase is the amount of operations that the Iraqi security forces are doing throughout Iraq in all areas, in Nineveh, Saladin, Diyala, and Anbar province. So their continued pressure and continued operations is really staying ahead of ISIS's abilities to plan and even attempt to conduct attacks. So we know that ISIS has talked about doing this, talked about disrupting elections, but it's really been the Iraqi security forces that have continued to do a full court press in this time leading up to the elections. And that's where the coalition is also assisting them through various means of intelligence and advising and, when requested, particular strikes.
Jeff Shogol, Task and Purpose.
Thank you. Colonel, one last question. As the situation in Iraq and Syria stabilizes, will that cause any changes for U.S. troops' pay and benefits, such as hostile fire pay, imminent danger pay, or the combat zone tax exclusion?
I can't answer that. I don't see that happening at all in the near future. We have to, number one, there's still fighting that's going on. There's still threats, and there still are there's still work to be done. So, and no one here makes that decision anyway. So I'll leave that back up to the Pentagon or whoever it is that makes that decision. I know that that's not necessarily something that those of us here are thinking about. We're thinking about finishing our job, doing our mission, and making sure our left and right flanks and our fellow coalition members are taken care of.
All right, Jeff. Any more? Any math questions? Okay. Ryan Brown, CNN, please.
Colonel, one last one. Have you received any questions from your Syrian partners about how long the U.S. or the coalition plans on staying in Syria? There's been a lot of discussion about this lately. Has that become a distraction or a subject of conversation as you engage with your partners?
I mean, clearly we spend a lot of time with our partners, and we've seen plenty of things being mentioned in open source. But I will keep those discussions that happen between our commanders on the ground between those commanders.
Okay. Anyone else? Colonel Dillon, do you have any closing words for us?
Well, you guys have heard me say several times that I don't discuss future operations, and I will say also that this is a very dynamic environment, and who knows what happens next week. So I am not going to be the one to say this is my last PPC, but if it is, it's been an honor to really represent all of the men and women who represent the coalition, and I hope that I have been able to do them justice. By standing up here and briefing you and talking to you on the phone, because they are really getting after it, and I know that this is a true coalition. I've got two partners in here from other countries. I'm proudly wearing, as you guys know, the New Zealand and the Australian patch on my shoulders here. And I've definitely talked to my Italian counterparts to practice my Italiano before I head back there. But it's been an honor, and all I'll say is our folks in this coalition, and then also at OSD between Eric and Rob Manning and Adrian Rankin-Galloway and the guys at CENTCOM, they're rock solid, and it's been an honor. And I know I've got probably another 2 weeks left, so I'm sprinting to the finish. I'm not done. My phone's always next to me, so feel free to call and ask questions until it's time for me to actually leave. So thank you very much.
We'll certainly miss you. Not sure you're going to miss us, and hope your replacement is spooled up. I'm sure you're going to get him ready to go and ready to face the crowd here. I believe this will be my last press briefing as well as I switch over to a different account. And thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate it, and goodbye, Colonel Dillon.